The Pure Drive's been the most popular racket in the world pretty much ever since Babolat developed it 30 years ago, but the Ezone 100 has been carving out a serious reputation for itself recently, and with the fact that both these rackets got an update for 2025, I figured now would be a perfect time to compare them. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So I've actually already done a full review of the new Pure Drive. You can watch that video by clicking the link up here. I haven't actually done a review of the Ezone 100 yet, but I thought this comparison would be a better idea first. Because this is my first video on this racket, I will go over all the updates Yonex has made, and I may also do a more long-term Ezone 100 review in the future. It's a racket I didn't really use until I started doing reviews on this channel, just because I've always been such a big fan of the 98. I kind of just forgot about the 100, but I used it a lot more last year, and it was a really good racket. Definitely different to the 98. The Ezone 100 is a true power racket and has less of that unique Ezone feel to it, but I actually think the Ezone 100 is pretty much the only power-oriented 100 that can hold a candle to the Pure Drive. Obviously, the Pure Drive has been kind of unrivaled in this category for a while, but the more people play with the Ezone 100, the more they realize just how good it is, and it kind of has been putting a dent into the Pure Drive's dominance. Now the question is, with all the updates Yonex has made, and they have made a lot, is it still comparable to the Pure Drive? What differences should you expect between the two and compared to the previous one? And the million-dollar question is it actually a better racket than the Pure Drive? I'm going to try and explain all of that today. This is going to be a really fun review. Power rackets are not really rackets I used to play with all that much, but I've developed a real appreciation for them recently, and I usually play some really good tennis with them. Now, before we go on, I do just want to remind you, as usual, that any of the rackets we talk about on this channel, you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So the first thing I want to talk about is the specs, because they obviously have similar specs. That's why they're in the same category of rackets. They both weigh 300 grams with 100 square inch head sizes, 16 by 19 string patterns, and thick variable beams. More specifically, starting with the Pure Drive, the Pure Drive's beam starts at 23 millimeters in the upper hoop, then goes all the way up to 26, and then back down to 23. This is the same beam profile it's been for years, although this new Pure Drive is a little bit softer than the previous one. This one flexes at 66 RA strung with Polytour Pro at 50 pounds, and the swing weight is 318. Now the Ezone also has a variable beam, but it is a little bit different to the previous versions. The last Ezone 100 had a 23.8, 26.5, and 22.5 millimeter beam. This one's gotten a little bit thicker in the upper hoop and in the throat. It's 24.5 millimeters up here, so almost a full millimeter thicker, which is pretty significant. It's that same 26.5 millimeters in the lower hoop, and then half a millimeter thicker in the throat, up to 23 millimeters. So it's gotten thicker pretty much all throughout, which is important because a thicker beam means more power, more stability, and a bigger sweet spot. And at this point, it's definitely a chunkier beam than the Pure Drives. Now, they haven't just thickened it, they've also changed the shape of this frame. It's pretty much the same thing they did to the Ezone 98, which I talk about in the video linked up here. They've squared it off in the upper hoop. Basically, by widening the frame up here, they're moving more mass farther up the frame. We're seeing this from a lot of brands nowadays. You got the Boom and the Gravity from Head, the Aero 98 from Babolat, and then the V-Core is a more extreme example of this from Yonex. More mass farther up the frame means more stability, more power, and more plow through. And when you combine that with the thicker beam profile, they've definitely designed this racket to be more powerful and forgiving than the previous one. It was already quite a powerful and forgiving racket, so it is interesting that they've gone in this direction. Now just quickly finishing up with the specs. This racket flexes at 65 RA, again strung with Polytour Pro at 50 pounds, and it has a 316 swing weight. Those are similar flex and swing weight specs to the Pure Drive, so another reason why this is such a logical comparison. And the final major update they've made to this frame is the addition of Minilon into the layup. Again, I talk about this more in the Ezone 98 review, but Minilon technology is actually a type of silk that comes from the Minamushi bagworm, and it's there to provide a more dampened and plush feel on impact. I haven't always been the biggest fan of Yonex's dampening technology, but I actually like this update on the Ezone 98, so that feel is actually where we're going to start this comparison. These are both power rackets, so they're super powerful, but the way they actually interact with the ball is pretty different at this point, probably the most different it has been in the last several generations. The Pure Drive's had a minor layup update, but it really hasn't changed all that much coming from the previous one. This is still quite a rigid racket with a firm feel, a short dwell time, and it pops the ball off the strings really instantaneously. It is a tiny bit softer and more comfortable because of the new dampening, but it still maintains that Pure Drive DNA, and that's definitely a good thing. That's what people like here, and I don't think they'll ever go too far away from that. The Ezone has changed quite a bit. The previous one had a slightly more plush feel than the Pure Drive, but this one is significantly more cushioned. All these updates have softened it up quite a bit. It's not softer in that it's a more flexible frame, it's softer in a more mushy way, like what's becoming quite common in the industry with all these dampening and stabilization technologies. Basically, what they've done here by thickening up the frame, opening it up in the top of the hoop, they've made the sweet spot bigger, and when you combine that with this silky, dampened feel, it's bigger and softer, which is why it ends up feeling a bit mushy. No, mushy feel hasn't always been my favorite, but I have come to appreciate it on certain rackets. Mushy means that the sweet spot isn't as sweet and well-defined, but it's also so much more forgiving on off-center hits. That's what you get on this new Ezone 100. The thing is, I'm not sure that was totally necessary because the previous version was already super forgiving, and like I said, already a little bit softer than the Pure Drive. To me, the drawback with that mushier feel is that you don't get the same feedback on contact, which is quite important to develop trust and connection with your frame. Now, of course, if you're looking for more comfort, this is definitely more comfortable than the previous Ezone. It's still not a comfortable racket, but I know a lot of players just need that little bit extra plushness and dampening in their power rackets to be able to play with them. If that's you, then this is the perfect update, and while the Pure Drive has gotten a little bit more comfortable, it's definitely not on the same level as this Ezone. Like I said, the Pure Drive still feels more firm and rigid with a shorter dwell time, which means it doesn't soak up nearly as much of the brunt of the ball. The thing is, that crisp, rigid feel is what's given the Pure Drive so much success over the years. It's kind of a magical poppy feel that isn't traditional but really addictive in its own way, and it's also so important for giving this racket its signature power, so let's talk about that now. In terms of power, we're talking about two absolute juggernauts here. For me, these are the two most powerful rackets that are still playable at a high level of tennis. You've obviously got more powerful oversized rackets, but that's kind of a different story. The Pure Drive's power is kind of a story as old as time. It's that combination of a thick beam with a stiff flex that gives it that super poppy, powerful sensation I was just talking about, and you can hit crazy top-end power here. This is a racket that makes you feel like you can hit winners from anywhere on the court. It's super fun to hit big shots with it, and that's why it's become such an addictive racket in the power game. The Ezone 100's been powerful for many generations, but it's never quite reached that same level as the Pure Drive. But with the updates they've made to this one, it brings it right up there for me. It's a bit of a different type of power. The Pure Drive is really that classic stiff power. This is more of a leverage-oriented type of power that you get from this modern shape with all the mass in the upper hoop. Of course, that thick beam and high RA also play their part in giving it huge top-end power, but it does feel a little bit different. This feels like it grabs onto the ball and absolutely sends it rather than just popping it off the strings instantaneously. It's also definitely more powerful than the previous Ezone, despite having a slightly plusher feel, which again all comes down to the shape. Now here's the thing, power can be a bit of a slippery slope. Too much power means that you lose control, and these are definitely still controlled enough for big hitters, but the Ezone is almost bordering on too much. It's not so much its top end power. It's always nice to feel like the racket can rip the ball when you take a big swing. The issue is more in terms of the depth it generates. Depth has gone up on this new Ezone compared to the last one because of those updates. Obviously the thicker beam is part of it, but the real big reason for it is the shape. With a wider upper hoop and more mass up there, you get more leverage over the ball and a more open string bed, which creates a higher launch angle. This racket generates so much depth, and that's where I think it's maybe a little bit too much, but of course that depth is also part of what makes this racket so forgiving. It requires very little effort to push the ball over the net, which is good for players with less perfect technique and a more compact stroke, but also good for players who want to hit big shots from difficult positions. That leverage means that even when you're really stretching for the ball, you can generate power out of nowhere. So there's a ton of potential to destabilize your opponent from anywhere around the court, even when you're scrambling. Of course, there is an issue that arises from this much easy depth and this high of a launch angle, especially when you combine that with the slightly mushy feel I was talking about earlier. A mushy, ambiguous sweet spot combined with a high launch angle leads to inconsistency issues. and I definitely feel that a little bit here compared to the Pure Drive and the previous Ezone. Especially at the beginning of my hit when I was getting used to this new design, I was pushing the ball too deep pretty often. Now there is a solution to this, spin, and we'll talk about that in the next section. But if you're not really focusing on spinning the ball, control may be a bit of an issue for you with this racket. It simply doesn't have that confidence-inducing consistency that I need from a frame when I'm going for lower percentage flat shots or when I haven't had the time to set up to hit with a lot of spin. An example of that would be on low balls where I'm kind of reaching forward to hit them. I like to sort of flick those back into play without necessarily brushing up with a full stroke, and I was definitely struggling to control my depth there. The slice is another example of a shot that doesn't use topspin, and you want that nice, solid, consistent feel from your frame. I didn't feel super confident slicing here. Sometimes I would hit a good slice, other times it would go too deep. Now I don't want to keep bashing the control here because we are talking about really subtle sensations, but there is another element to control that's a little bit lacking here: stability. That surprised me because in theory this new shape is supposed to be more stable, but I actually think with the way this racket's gotten softer and it has a longer dwell time, it's lacking a bit of weight in the handle to back up that softness. The more time the ball spends in the string bed, the more mass you need pushing back on it for stability, and I do think this is just teetering on too light. I think a little bit more mass down here would be ideal. So it's definitely not the most consistent and controlled racket that you're gonna find. And you might be thinking, well, it's a power racket, that means it's going to suffer for control. But the reason I'm bringing it up here is because I don't get that same sensation on the Pure Drive or on the previous Ezone 100. I definitely found that Ezone a little bit more stable. I never thought it needed more weight in the handle, and that's because it had a stiffer, more solid feel up in the hoop. And then you've got the Pure Drive, which is very different in its control profile. One, because it has a much lower launch angle, and two, because it has that more poppy responsiveness off the strings, so you don't get that same ambiguous, inconsistent feel. It's a bit of a unicorn in that sense, where it's such a powerful racket that does generate a lot of depth, but I've never been surprised by the Pure Drive. This is a remarkably consistent and solid racket considering its power and weight. It does take a second for me to adjust to its power when I'm coming from something super control oriented, but once I'm adjusted, it's definitely not a control racket, but I feel in total control. That's the biggest difference between these two frames. They have similar amounts of power, but the Ezone has a bit more of that wild launchy power, and the Pure Drive is more solid and consistent. I think it's pretty clear to see with these clips that I'm not quite as confident with the Ezone. I do a lot more of that whipping motion where I come over the ball instead of hitting through it, and that's usually a sign that I'm not fully confident in a frame. My natural preference is to hit more into the ball, so brushing up is less of me wanting to do that and more of me kind of copping out from the shot and playing the percentages because I'm not confident it won't fly. What I will say is that because it has more depth, a bigger sweet spot, and a higher launch, it's actually a little bit more forgiving at slower swing speeds, which is really impressive because the Pure Drive has kind of always been the gold standard in that domain. Especially because that sweet spot is so big and plush, it doesn't punish you as much on off-center hits, and it's especially more comfortable on off-center hits, which is a big part of a racket being forgiving nowadays. Now, I want to be careful with what I'm about to say because this definitely isn't a clash, but that's what I mean when I say it's more forgiving. It's got a bit more of that clash forgiving feel to it. Now, here's the other thing. This racket isn't as controlled as the Pure Drive, but once you factor spin into the equation, things do get a little bit different. Flat shots are better on the Pure Drive. That much is very obvious to me, but a lot of modern players don't hit flat. They prefer to rely on spin for control, and that's where the Ezone definitely has a leg up. Now, the Pure Drive has always been spin-friendly enough to work well for modern tennis, but it's never been a true spin racket. It's spin-friendly because it's stiff and it has a 16x19 string pattern, but there's not much beyond that. The Ezone, on the other hand, has kind of always colored the lines between being a spin racket and a power racket, and spin has actually increased on this new one, again, because of the updates in design. I briefly mentioned this earlier when I was talking about the higher launch, but squaring off the top of the hoop opens up the string bed up there, and a more open string bed means more spin. The fact that you also have more leverage over the ball because of that higher concentration of mass just compounds that more open string bed to create a very spinny feel. Then you've also got the throat, which is way more aerodynamically shaped than the Pure Drive. This is almost as aero as the Pure Aero itself, which means it complements that windshield wiper motion better than the Pure Drive. Obviously, that windshield wiper motion is one of the most effective ways to generate spin, so at this point with the redesigned hoop, this is almost a spin racket disguised as a power racket. Once I wrapped my head around that and understood that it's not going to be as solid and stable for flat hitting, I started hitting more purposeful spin shots, and that's when those inconsistency issues started going away. By the end of my hit, I was definitely playing this more like a spin racket than a power racket, which is how I think this racket should be played to get the most out of it. I prefer the way I hit with the Pure Drive, but that doesn't mean the Ezone is a worse racket. It's just different, and that leads me nicely into the next section, where I'm going to talk about who these two rackets are made for. Now, what's interesting with this comparison is that I actually think these two rackets are more different than they have been in a long time. The previous Ezone 100 and Pure Drive 100 were actually pretty similar. I still think the Pure Drive was more consistent for flat shots and the Ezone was more spin friendly, but that gap is wider now. Lucky for me, that makes explaining who these two rackets are made for pretty easy. The Ezone for more spin-oriented styles, the Pure Drive if you want a bit more consistency and more variety as well. They are still similar in a lot of ways in that they're extremely powerful, very user-friendly and forgiving, so if you're looking for that but you know a little bit more specifically about what you want in terms of spin versus flat hitting, then the choice is actually pretty easy. I do think these are by far the two most outstanding power rackets right now. They're really easy to play good tennis with, and that's a huge compliment to give to a racket, and I actually think a lot more people should be looking at these. I know that sounds kind of crazy because they're already so popular, but take me as an example. I prefer hitting with heavier, more control-oriented players' frames, but I actually think I play better tennis with this style of racket. User-friendliness should not be confused with too easy to use. No one is too good for these rackets, and the proof of that is that you've still got pros using them. Maybe not exactly these two versions of them, but some version of the Ezone 100 and the Pure Drive. If you shy away from this because you're like, nah, I don't need user-friendly, maybe don't think of it that way. Maybe think of them more as making good tennis easier to play. Of course, there are still players who won't appreciate these. If you're looking for that soft, noodly control, or you just like the feel of a classic player's frame, you're not going to get that here. Now, personally, I've always preferred the Pure Drive compared to the Ezone 100, and on this generation, that gap has increased a little bit, but that's just because I have a more flat style, which this suits better, not because it's necessarily a better racket. In terms of what a power racket is supposed to be, I do think the Pure Drive is a slightly better representation, just because power rackets are meant to hit flatter, more penetrative shots, but the Ezone is better for a spinny style. I also think that a more long-term review of this Ezone is a good idea, because with a couple tweaks here and there, I actually think I could solve some of those inconsistency issues. For one, I tested this with Polytour Pro, which is obviously a softer, mushier string, which kind of amplifies the frame's inconsistency issues, so something a little bit firmer and more responsive could be nice. Then I also want to try some weight in the handle. I don't love doing that to my power-oriented 100s because I think their low weight is so important to the way they play, but just a few grams in the handle could be exactly what you need to boost that stability. With that said, that is going to be the end of this review. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo either of these two frames, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.